All right. Well, last week here at Joy, we started a new journey together. We were in the book of Exodus for a full year. And last week we started a journey together through the New Testament book of 2 Timothy. Now, 2 Timothy is the second of two letters that Paul writes to this guy named Timothy. And 2 Timothy, it's a letter of encouragement, and it's kind of giving a lot of final instructions that Paul writes in it, because Paul is writing it sitting in basically a dungeon, a prison cell in Rome, as he's awaiting his execution. He'd been given the death sentence for following Christ and for spreading the word of Christ. So he's awaiting that execution, and he's writing these final instructions and encouragement to this man named Timothy. Now, who's this Timothy? Well, Timothy is this young man, this young Christian man, and Paul actually refers to him as his son in the faith, which means Paul probably helped lead him to new faith in Jesus Christ, and he's taken him under his wing to kind of mentor him and instruct him and help him grow. As a matter of fact, since Paul's second missionary journey, Timothy has accompanied Paul on his travels and in his ministry and helping him along the way as Paul's strengthening and planting churches. And then Paul would also send Timothy out on assignment to help in the ministry. In fact, Timothy's latest assignment, Paul had sent Timothy to the church in the city of Ephesus. Now, the church of Ephesus was once a strong and thriving church in the Roman Empire, and it was a thriving church, but more recently to this, they had been facing trouble and really kind of falling away, and they had these false teaching coming in. So Paul sends Timothy there to become the new pastor there and to correct some of these wrongs and to lead the church into being a healthy church again. In fact, that was Paul's first letter to Timothy, was instructions to Timothy as he's going on this assignment to the church of Ephesus. And Paul shares with Timothy, this is what a healthy church looks like. And we went through this first letter in Timothy last summer. So if you want to check that out, you can check it out on our website and all that he's saying here. But now we have 2 Timothy, and it's written a few years later. And again, now Paul's in prison, so he's no longer out with the churches. He's been arrested, and he's been given this death sentence. And now Paul is writing to Timothy, who's in Ephesus, and he's basically urging Timothy to remain faithful in following Jesus and reflecting him in his world, as Paul kind of lives out this faith in this ministry in an ever-increasing hostile world for following Jesus. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? To maybe our world today. And there's a lot of similarities with the hostility and how a world is against God. I mean, that's why 2 Timothy, this letter, it's very timely for us. The words of Paul to Timothy are also words of Paul and words of God, really, for us if we're following Jesus, to remain faithful, because they're for us as we follow God's call in our own life to reflect Jesus in our world, in our workplace or in our school or with our families, as we face ever-increasing hostility for following Jesus in our world today. And we face division and hatred and even rejection of us and our faith. And in fact, the whole theme of 2 Timothy is this, and this is kind of, as we're looking at Timothy, it's faithful, reflecting Jesus in our world. And because this is such a timely message, we're really going to take our time through Timothy. In fact, you saw our scripture reading, it's 5 verses this morning. And we're going to take our time going through this message because we need to unpack what Paul's saying here, because it's also a message right where we are today, and it's so timely. So last week what we did in digging into that, we looked at the first two verses in Timothy, which were kind of an introduction to Timothy, where Paul introduces himself and Timothy, but also he notes the critical role that mentoring somebody and being mentored plays in the life of someone who wants to follow Jesus. It's important that we mentor others, but also that we have a mentor in our life that can help grow us. So that's what we talked about last week. So today we come to verse 3. Verse 3, and we kind of read this, and we're going to look more closely at this passage, because this passage that we read today, it's important to remember here that Paul is telling Timothy in the passage we just read about being faithful in his calling. So this is the aspect of faithfulness we're looking at. Paul says, in your calling, or what you're called to do. Now for Timothy it was to be a pastor, but generally it was to reflect Jesus in his world. Just as all of us are given that calling as well, to reflect Jesus in our world. So this passage this morning is about remaining faithful or being faithful to God's calling for us to reflect Jesus. And that was important for Timothy because he would face opposition, and his mentor, his greatest spiritual influence is about to be gone. He's about to be executed. So now Timothy no longer has him, and it's such a big task, and he's going to face opposition. So Paul's saying you need to be faithful. You need to keep faithful and to remember that God has called you. And sometimes Paul's saying, Timothy, you may feel like you're alone and you may be afraid. So I want to remind you to be faithful. Do you ever feel like that in your faith? And in following Jesus, especially in our world today, I'm afraid to speak up. I'm afraid to speak up at work because everybody's going to jump down my neck, or afraid to bring anything up, in our world. Or you feel all alone and you're like, I'm the only one who could share this at school, and then, I can't do this alone. And maybe you feel alone. And if you ever feel like that, then this is why this passage is so important, and it's so important that we look closer at what Paul's saying. So let's dive in, and we'll spend a couple minutes just looking at what Paul's saying here and unpacking what he's saying. So hopefully you have your Bibles. You can open up to 2 Timothy. I said 2 Timothy is really easy to find. You find 1 Timothy, and it's right after that. But it's in the New Testament. It's towards the end of the New Testament. And you'll see books like 1 and 2 Thessalonians. It's right around there, and you'll be able to find Timothy in this letter. But we're in verse 3, and it's going to be up on the screen as well. So let's look at this. Paul says in verse 3, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. So what Paul's talking about, he's basically saying, I am so thankful to God, right, that I myself am remaining faithful in my calling. This is the same faith, the same God I serve, just as my ancestors serve. And I serve him with a clear conscience, which isn't saying I'm serving him because I'm so perfect, so I don't have anything to worry about. But Paul's saying, no, but I have a genuine faith in my life, so I can stand before God because I know I'm resting in Jesus in what I'm doing. And that's why my conscience is clear, because I'm trusting Jesus. And he's saying, I'm so thankful to that. And because I'm so thankful, I remember you constantly in my prayers, both day and night. So Paul's saying, hey, I am constantly and consistently praying for you, for your faithfulness as you follow Jesus, just as I'm following Jesus. And that's a call for us to be praying for those in our life. Do you know the greatest act of love we can do for another human being is to pray for them? Do you know that? We can talk about all other things. Oh, it means buying them something. It means taking care of, making sure they're safe. No, the greatest single thing we can do for someone is to pray for them. Because in praying for somebody, what we're doing is we're bringing that person and we're bringing them into the throne room of God. And we're saying, God, I present them to you, and I'm trusting you to work in their life. It gives me chills just to think about that. I remember when I was in college, my mom used to send me notes and just say, we prayed for you this morning in my staff devotions or something. And it always made me feel great. This past Tuesday, we had our leadership meeting. And our elders and deacons were together. And Eileen sharing how, she goes over and helps watch Christopher during the week and things. And she was saying, it was really crazy the other night. I'm sitting there. And you know how parents are today. They have cameras everywhere. And I know, Chris, they have cameras and monitors everywhere. So Eileen's down in the living room, and she's looking at one of the monitors at Christopher's room, and he's laying in the crib, and all of a sudden she sees a figure in the room. And it's kind of dark, and she's like, uh-oh. So she starts looking closer at it, and the closer she looks at it, you know what she realizes? That's Chris. And she says, what's Chris doing? And she sees Chris, and Chris is laying his hand on Christopher, praying for him. Isn't that awesome? That's the greatest thing we can do for those in our life, is to pray for somebody. So Paul's saying, Timothy, I am constantly and consistently praying for you. That's how important it is, bringing you before God. And then he continues in verse 4. He says this. He says, now I'm praying for you as I remember your tears. Okay? I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. So now Paul starts talking about, I'm just not talking about Timothy as some stranger. I'm just lifting him up, this guy named Timothy. I know you. In fact, I'm praying for you specifically because you've had tears for me. He remembers his tears. You know what he's saying? He's talking about his relationship that Timothy and Paul had. And he basically is saying, hey, I remember how how when we parted, when you had to part me, you were sad about it, and you felt exposed by it, and you had tears, and I meant this to you, and so I remember that, and I want God to encourage you that. But Paul also says, but I also want you to know, Timothy, I need you too. You've blessed me just as I blessed you. And that's what he says. He goes, I long to see you, Timothy, because you're an encouragement to me. In fact, that I may be filled with joy when we're together. I have joy because you're with me. So he's talking about this relationship he has with Timothy and how important that is. And then verse 5, he says, and I'm reminded. Here's why I'm filled with joy, he says. I'm reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure, I see this, that it dwells in you. So Paul says, Timothy, I'm reminded of your sincere faith. What does that mean, your sincere faith? Well, what Paul's talking about here is he's saying your faith that's not hypocritical. You're not faking your relationship with God. You're not putting on airs and trying just to kind of make it look like you have this relationship. You have a real and a genuine commitment to God and following Him. He's not saying you have a perfect relationship with God. That's not what sincere means. But it's, Timothy, you're simply trusting in Jesus alone. And I love that because it's real and it's relatable. Other people are going to look to you and they're going to see Jesus in you. So I'm reminded of that. In fact, I'm reminded of that because that faith you have, it wasn't an accident. As a matter of fact, that was passed on to you because your grandmother and your mother had that same kind of faith. Your grandmother, Lois, and your mother, Eunice, had that same kind of faith. And what that's unusual to be talking about two women investing and entrusting and nurturing faith in their son, especially their young teenage son. Because in the culture of that day, that was the job of the father. Now, when kids were really young, the mother would have them in the home. But once they got to about the age of 7 or 8, especially young boys, they were to be educated, especially in religious matters, by the man of the home. Now, we know Timothy's dad was Greek, so he might not have been a believer. So his grandmother and his mother, though, had such a strong faith that they were an influence on him. And they were a huge key for him not only coming to Jesus, but growing in Jesus. And having his faith, that's a saving faith, become now a sincere faith, a real and a lasting faith. So this is what Paul's talking about in these first 3 verses. So let me just kind of summarize what he's saying. Paul's basically saying, I'm a man of genuine faith, and I'm invested in you, Timothy, in your growth and your faithfulness. Just as your own family was used by God as examples and influences in your life, Timothy. So that you have a sincere faith that people in real life can see. And that's kind of what he's saying. So how do we learn something from this about remaining faithful? Well, in what Paul's talking about here in this sincere faith and about him investing in Timothy and his grandma and his mom investing in him, here's what we learn about remaining faithful, and it's important that we grasp this, that we're most faithful to God's call in reflecting Jesus in our world when we appreciate God's work through others. Paul's saying, hey, notice this, Timothy. God is working. When we come to faith in Jesus Christ, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like we're some hermit on some island and all of a sudden we're like, oh, Jesus. Do you know what happens? God places people, He places circumstances, and He places events in our lives that we might not even notice. And He places them all in our lives as influences to draw us into a relationship with Jesus. And Paul's saying, appreciate or cherish this. Be thankful to God that God works through other people. And to cherish that God cares so much for you that He places other people in your life and events and circumstances to draw you to Him and to grow you in Him. Isn't that cool? So here Paul's telling Timothy, and he's telling us though, he's saying basically grasp this. Grasp that God does this and identify. Take time to stand back and say, who has God placed in my life? Maybe it is a parent, or maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a friend at work, or someone at school who speaks of Christ. And it might be that you don't even know and somebody's praying for you, but identify and say, I know people had to be praying for me because I didn't figure this out on my own. And to grasp that and say, man, God, you are working. And we realize that not only has God worked in our life for us to come to Christ, but God will continue to work even through these means, beyond what we may first realize. And this is what Paul's kind of getting at in Ephesians chapter 3, where Paul says this. He says, now to him, he's at the end of one of his prayers, and he's praising God for this. He says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work in us. God does for us more than we can ever think, more than we can ask, more than we can ever see. God is working. And because of that, we can remain faithful even when we can't see it. Even when we may be afraid or discouraged or down, we can know this. These people that God uses, they're in our lives. It's no accident. It's no coincidence to say, oh, somebody shared Christ with me. Wow, that was lucky I was there. No, it wasn't. It was God's plan. It's not an accident that God uses these people. So when we appreciate this, you know what? We become encouraged to keep faithful in following Jesus, so that he can be reflected right where we are, so that God can use us in other people's lives in the same way. In fact, when we take time to identify and appreciate God's work through others, you know, we're reminded why it's so important that we do this. Do you know why it's important we know that God's working and we look for how God's working? Because I don't know about you, sometimes you can feel like you're abandoned. Like sometimes you're like, man, God, why am I going through this? This stinks. I see other people go around and they're not having struggles. Their car doesn't keep breaking. I don't know that you care about me. But then all of a sudden you start to realize, man, God, you've used all these people in my life and you've brought these things in my life. So we realize that God does in fact care for us. We also realize there's sometimes, I don't know about you, but you can feel all alone. And you can say, man, God, you brought me to faith in you, but I'm just out on this rock somewhere. And no, there's all these people that are praying for us and they want to come alongside us and they want to invest in our lives. And what that reminds us is that we're not alone. And we're also reminded, just as God has worked, he will continue to work. God is faithful. So we're most faithful in reflecting Jesus when we appreciate or cherish God's work through others, is what Paul's saying. Then Paul continues in the next verse. Let's kind of look at that to understand, again, Paul's leading somewhere here with this. And he says, so when we appreciate this, Timothy, it's a great thing. And here's the reason why we need to appreciate this. Verse 6, he says, for this reason, or as a result of this, when you appreciate this, here's what it should produce, or what you should be doing, or what should come of this. He says, for this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of hands. Isn't that cool? Fan into flames. And it's this picture, right? In the ancient Roman world, they didn't have matches, they didn't have lighters or anything to light fires. You know, they had to make fire, right? They had to get sparks and you know, kind of get a fire going. But they didn't do that every time they needed a fire. What they would often do is once they lit a fire, when that fire would go out, they would save a coal, an ember, that was still kind of bright yellow. Do you ever have that after a fire? And they would keep that. And sometimes, because that would keep for a long time, it's just this little coal. And then what they would do is they're saying, oh, it's time for dinner, we need to get a fire going. They would take that coal and they would put, you know, some kindling around it and things like that. And then they would fan that, right? Or they'd blow on it. You ever blow on a coal when it's on like cotton or something? And you blow on it and what happens? You fan it into a flame. And that's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying God's deposited something in you and now you need to fan that into flame. You have a responsibility or a response to God in this. Right? And he says, what are you fanning into flame? The gift that God has given you, that was given to you by the laying on of hands. And sometimes we think of that, all right, God gave us gift. Well, he's talking about spiritual gifts here, right? What's a spiritual gift? Spiritual gifts, those special abilities that are given by the Holy Spirit at new birth when we come to faith in Jesus. They're given to every believer. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're trusting in him for salvation, you have a spiritual gift, at least one. You might not know what it is necessarily, but there are these special abilities given by the Holy Spirit for the purpose of building up the body of Christ. Things like leadership or prayer or faith or teaching or helps. Those are spiritual gifts. However, when Paul talks about the gift here, he's talking about more than just spiritual gifts. Because he says it's been given to you as in laying on of hands. Well, spiritual gifts are given to us when we come to faith in Jesus Christ. They're not given to us later on necessarily as an act. Now, sometimes they can be bestowed, but we get them when we come to faith in Jesus Christ. So what's Paul talking about here with the laying on of hands? Well, he's talking about when Timothy was commissioned to his calling, and more specifically, when you were commissioned to ministry. They had a service for Paul when he became a pastor. When I became a pastor, when I came here to Joy, I remember we had a service, and we had pastors come around me and lay hands on me and commission me. And what was he commissioning me? Commissioning me to follow Jesus in what God has called me to do. And this is what Paul's talking about here. It's this commissioning of Paul, so we can understand this gift that God gives as in reference to the calling that he gives to each of us. So this, I believe, is the gift. And notice it's gift, singular, not gifts. Okay? That God gives. And Paul's referencing. It's our calling, which includes certainly spiritual gifts, but really all that God gives us to be able to follow Jesus and reflect him. Things like a gift of God is the influence of others. It's being able to understand his words. It's different talents. It's opportunities he places before us. All these things that God places before us and gives to us, Paul's saying, fan them into flame. God has given you that as a burning ember. And now fan it into flame. So we can better understand what Paul's telling Timothy here in relationship to being faithful or remaining faithful. He's telling Timothy to fan into flame or utilize or make useful all that God has given you or placed before you. You starting to see this now? In other words, he's saying, we're most faithful to God in reflecting, faithful to God's call and reflecting Jesus in our world when we not only appreciate God's work through others, but we exercise our faith. Did you ever get into really good shape? You had a time, and maybe you're in really good shape. I'm in A shape, but you go out and you get in really good shape, and you go to the gym, right? And you're like months you're going to the gym, and you are just cut and you're ripped, and you've been working on not only your strength but your flexibility, and you're like, yeah, man, I can do all this stuff, and you're in this great shape, right? And then you say, all right, I'm in great shape, and then you know what you do for the next 6 months? You go and you sit on your couch and you eat butterscotch crimpets and watch TV. What happens to your good shape? What happens? What happens to your muscles? They atrophy, don't they? So you may have them, but they become useless. This is this kind of picture that Paul's kind of talking about when he's saying fan into flame. Don't let this ember eventually go out, because then it's useless. It's just a piece of charcoal you're left with that you can't fan into anything. So Paul says, you have this, you need to utilize it, you need to exercise it. And that's the way we grow in faith, and that's the way we grow in our relationship with Jesus, is we use what he gives us. There's a lot of times where we're like, oh, God, give me this, give me more. I need more of an experience with you, or I need to know more about you. Well, sometimes God's like, well, I've given you enough that you can start following me. Use that, and I'll give you more. So we can use what God's already given, or exercise our faith. So when we're looking at that, if we're not out there seeking or we're walking in God's call, talking about Jesus at work or looking for opportunities or at school or with their family to let them know about Jesus, if we're not seeking or serving and seeking to exercise our faith, we're missing out, and it's going to be useless in us. And this is what Paul talks about to the church in Colossae. He's talking to the Colossians, and here's what he says. Therefore, if you've received Jesus Christ as Lord, if you call yourself a Christian, walk in him. See, it's more than just talk, isn't it? He says, therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, but established in the faith. See, you're not just rooted in him, but now you're established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. You see, when roots are active, what happens is the tree or the plant grows, doesn't it? And it eventually blooms, and that's that praise or appreciation. If the roots aren't active, what happens? The tree dies. We just had a tree that came under our fence, and I took out an axe, and I just cut the root, And guess what's happening to our tree now? It's starting to kind of go away. But that's what happens when the roots don't do anything, and they're not doing, so they're not active. And when we're not active in our faith or active in following Jesus, guess what happens with our faithfulness? It starts to wane. So Paul says to Timothy, exercise your faith. Get out there. And he's urging Timothy, keep growing. Keep growing. Keep following Jesus no matter what. Don't get discouraged. Keep doing it because God's going to grow you. And Paul's like, Timothy, even after I'm gone, and you may feel alone, know that you're not, so you can keep going. God is with you, and God will send people alongside you. Okay? In fact, Paul kind of alludes to that as the passage closes. Look at verse 7 real quickly. He says, here's why you should exercise your faith. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. Why should we press on? Because God didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and self-control. You know, as you read 1st and 2nd Timothy, one of the common themes you see in Paul's encouragement of Timothy is about being bold. Now, one of the reasons Paul may be telling Timothy this is, again, Timothy will need boldness, but maybe Timothy's a little meek. You know, Timothy may say, man, I don't always feel like going out, or sometimes I get intimidated to speak up. You know, I'm sure Timothy's the only one who deals with it. I know I never deal with this, struggle with boldness. But so Paul reminds him, be bold. So here, this is kind of what he's talking to Timothy about, and he's encouraging him, and he's saying, no, be bold. And how he says this, as Paul does this, he says, you know what? If you're fearful, that's not from God. You see, the spirit that brings fear in our life is the spirit of the enemy, because fear will stop us in our tracks. So Paul says, recognize that if you're fearful, that's not of God. That's not God saying, well, you should be afraid of this. No, that's a different spirit. Here's what the Spirit of God gives, right? He says the Spirit of God is about giving something so much more. It says the Spirit of God, or the Spirit in you, is of power, love, even the power to love our enemies or those who persecute us. Do you know where that comes from? It doesn't come from us, because I know when somebody's not nice to me, I don't want to be nice to them. But do you know where loving our enemy comes from? The power of God in us. That's the only way we're going to love people that are unlovable in our lives or difficult in our lives. It's through the power of God. Because naturally we don't have it. So he says of power and love and self-control. Now, by using the word self-control here, Paul isn't meaning self-control as you're going to be disciplined. That's not what he's talking about with this self-control. In fact, a better word, and as we look at the nuance of the original language where Paul's using this word self-control, a better way to say that is maybe sober-minded. Have you ever heard sober-minded? Or clear-headed might be a better idea of this. And Paul says, you know what God's Spirit gives us? God's Spirit can give us the ability to take a step back and see things clearly, even in the heat of battle. Even when things are coming from us and we just want to react. God's Spirit can say, wait, look at this for what it really is. See it for what it really is. So that we don't take things personally. Somebody yells at us for being a Christian, we're just like, oh, I'm a horrible person. No, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting God. And God reminds us of that. And they still need to know Jesus, and we need to see them through Jesus' eyes. So, and we don't see this hostility as rejection of us, but of Jesus, and that we can keep our message and our love focused on Jesus and what he can do. We're not trying to win arguments with people when we share Jesus. We're not telling people everything we know and how great we are. We're presenting people Jesus and how great he is. I love what Steve Brown says. We're just beggars telling other beggars where we found bread. That's all we're doing. And Paul says, so that's what God gives us. That's from the Spirit of God, is being self-controlled. Again, the spirit of fear, it's self-focused. The spirit of fear says, man, I don't have this. I don't measure up. I don't have the ability to withstand. I don't have the intelligence to stand. I don't have the power to do this. And then fear comes from that because we don't. The Spirit of God is God-focused, right? It's his power. It's his love that seeks redemption, through his Son and his truth. And it's self-control, actually his controlling us, right? so that we can, stop and take things in from his perspective. So in other words, we're most faithful to God's call in our life, reflecting him in our world, when we not only appreciate that God puts people in our lives like that, not only exercising God's call, but we also are most faithful when we walk with our confidence in God. That's what he's saying. You want to remain faithful? Don't be confident in yourself, because I don't know about you, but I can only do so much and I can only go so far, and I'm not much. So if you're here at this church and you're saying, I'm following Pastor Mark, you're wasting your time, because I don't always do the right thing. I don't know. I'm not always the perfect or anything like that. Jesus is the one that we're following, and Jesus is the one we're placing our confidence in. And he's the one we're looking at. We carry on. We remain faithful to God's truth and his ways, even in our world that's hostile to him, not through our own strength, our own ability, but rather when our confidence is rooted in him. And we say, well, this is about God, so God can do anything. Why? Because God's over everything, isn't he? He created everything. He sustains everything. So there's nothing bigger than God. So if God can do all things, maybe I'll trust him. And I'll put my confidence in him. If you remember back when we went through Exodus, and those of you that weren't there, I'll give you a little recap. After the Israelites were released from slavery in Egypt, right? And they said, just go. And they start making their way back to the promised land, right? And they come to the Red Sea. And as they're camped at the Red Sea, something happens back in Egypt. Pharaoh has second thoughts, and he says, I'm going to go get them and bring them back into slavery. So he goes with his whole army to go and to either wipe out the Israelites and bring the rest back to slavery. Right? And they come charging down on the Israelites. The Israelites hear about this, and they're like, we have nowhere to run. We have the Red Sea to our back, and they're coming at our front. And what do? They say, we're doomed. And they go to Moses, how could you lead us out into the desert only that we die? We should just surrender right away, and at least we'll be able to live. Right? And their confidence, again, is in themselves and who they are. And God takes Moses aside and says, don't worry about this. And he tells them what he's going to do. He's going to part the Red Sea so they can walk through. So then Moses goes to the people. And this is amazing what he says. It's in Exodus chapter 14. It says, Moses said to the people, fear not. Again, not the spirit of fear. Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord. He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. And that was the truth. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. That's a verse, and that's a truth, and that's a promise of God. That's not just for the Israelites, it's for all of us, and it's worth putting to memory. That God will fight for us. We only have to be silent. Sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of God's way and just trust it to him. Say, this isn't about me at all. And we put our confidence in God, and in the same way, God's going to be our strength and our shield as we go out into our world. So we don't have to fear. We don't have to waver in our faith. Actually, we can strengthen our faith and root it in God for us. So then we not only remain faithful, but we're strong and faithful, right? In God. So rather, we can keep faithful to his call, focusing on him, not ourselves. So, as we wrap up this passage, what's our takeaway? What's our takeaway for this? All right, we just heard Paul say this to Timothy, and we said, yeah, it's for us. What do we need to remember as we go about our day-to-day, and we're watching the Eagles and we start to get angry, okay? Or we're going to school tomorrow and the bus gets a flat tire, or we forgot about a quiz or a paper, or we're going to work and we get stuck in traffic, and we're just like, ah! How do we remember? Here's our takeaway for our message. It's going to be up on the screen. Here it is. Being faithful in our calling means making the most out of what God has given us. That's what Paul's saying. If you want to be faithful in your calling and reflecting Jesus in our world, what it is we make the most of what God's given us. We embrace what God has given us. He's given us others into our lives to invest in us, right? He has given us opportunities that then we get to walk and grow in him. And he's given us a promise that he is with us so that we can place our confidence in him. That's what he's telling us that, right? So we do that by appreciating his work, by exercising our faith, and by walking with confidence. Again, if you're trusting in Jesus Christ for salvation right now, and you're trusting him and his work, then you have a calling. We all have a calling. And sometimes God even gives us a more specific calling and says, I want you to serve in Sunday school, or be a missionary, or be a light at your school. But he gives us a calling that embraces us all, and Jesus talked about it at the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill shouldn't be hidden. What does that mean? We're all called to reflect Jesus, to point to him, so our world sees Jesus and the greatness of God. That's our calling in our lives. That's why we're here. That's why we're parents, to point our kids to Jesus so that they can then reflect Jesus in our world. So we're all called to that. So as we have that calling, we need to remain faithful to it. Wherever we are, through whatever we may be doing, at our workplace, at school tomorrow, with our family, this is still our calling. This is what we're here. This is what God has us here for. This is what God has poured into us so that then we can help reflect Jesus, so that God can be known for his greatness, his love, and his grace that he extends upon all who receive him. So remember, being faithful in our calling means making the most of all that God has given us. And that's what we do. So I want to encourage you this week as we go to look at what God's given you, appreciate it, exercise it, and then be confident in it, not yourself. All right, let's pray.